Welcome to class. Welcome to
Yeah.
class. Instead of Claire today, we have Samantha helping out. Samantha, do you want to introduce yourself for
Hi,
Sam?
everyone. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome everyone coming into the class, into our knitting socks from the toe up class. Darren is going to be your teacher today, and I am Samantha. I'm going to be hanging out in the comments section with you to answer any questions you might have.
No, Pluto, no.
And any questions I can't answer, I'm going to pass along to Darren, and he'll get to them when there's a pause in between demos. So if you have any questions or anything comes up for you, we ask that you leave it in the chat. And I'll also be putting the handout for this class in the chat, so you can find it there if you didn't get it before the class. Just a reminder, this class is being recorded. So if you need to go back for any reason, you can watch it again starting tomorrow at michaels.com/classes or on the Michaels YouTube channel. And so now that all of that's out of the way, I'm going to pass this off to Darren and let him take it away.
Okay, welcome to class. This is the knitting socks from the toe up class. It's a really fun class because we're not going to use a pattern. I'm going to teach you how to do this with a formula that is available. It's very common. I didn't make this up. It's very common way to make socks. I started crocheting socks years ago, and I was doing it in a very, very similar way. But it's a very straightforward way. If you've never knitted socks before, then this is a great way to get started. And then after you've learned this way, there are lots of other ways to knit socks. You can do all different types of heels, all different types of toes. You could do top down, but this is the way I like to do it. So we want to go ahead and change the view to the view of my hands, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. All right. So this is a sock that I knitted, and it's knitted with very, very large yarn. And the nice thing about knitting with very, very large yarn for making a sock is that you can get through the whole process very fast. Knitting with sock yarn, it takes a long time to finish the sock. And so sometimes that's frustrating, especially when you're learning, because you want to like knit the gusset and knit the heel flap a couple of times so you remember how to do it. So just a little bit about the anatomy of a sock. So here is, of course, the toe. And when we cast on, we're actually going to cast on right here along this edge. We continue to knit the toe to right here. Then this is the foot of the sock. So from here to here is knitted in the round, just like normal, just like a standard tube. And then here we're going to create a gusset. And that creates a little extra space in our sock, and it sets us up to turn the heel so that it's not shaped like a tube sock, that it's actually shaped more like a foot. This little tiny bit right here, just this little tiny bit, is our heel turn, and that creates the shape for the heel flap, and then the leg of the sock. And then you can knit the leg of the sock however long you want it to be. That is the basic anatomy and setup of a sock. So it's a lot of fun. And then after you've practiced with this big yarn, this is a really nice, it's a nice house slipper. You can wear these around the house. You probably would never wear these with shoes or boots. Probably make your shoes or boots very tight and not very comfortable, but you could wear these around the house. You could, just use them as bedroom slippers, and they make great gifts. So if you have any last minute gifts you need to come up with, these would be very nice gifts because they do work up very fast on this large yarn. So I don't know if everybody has your handout, but I hope you either do have the handout or Samantha will put it in the chat so that you can download it. There's a lot of great information in it. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about measuring your foot, because we're not going to use a pattern. So we want to make sure that you are knitting this sock that will fit the foot that you're knitting for. So you're either going to measure your foot, or whomever you're knitting this sock for, you will measure their feet or have them measure it. And in the handout, we have this little drawing that I worked up. And there are a lot of measurements on this. We don't really need all of these measurements. If you're knitting a sock for somebody who has very hard to fit feet or unusually shaped feet, then you might need all of the measurements to really get them a really nice fit. People that don't have, like, maybe they have an unusually shaped foot for whatever reason, would really appreciate having socks that fit them very, very nicely. So, but for most people, what we're really going to need is we're going to need number 3, which is measuring around the ball of the foot. And that's right here. That's kind of the fattest part of the foot right here. The inseam we're not really going to need, and that's also including the arch of the foot. We're going to need to measure from the toe to where your foot joins the leg. So right here from your toe up to here. So right here. So this is like just the main part of the foot. And then we want to know how long your foot is, your entire foot. And those are really the main measurements that we need. Now, if you know you have like really skinny ankles or really large ankles, you might want to double check the ankle measurement. If you have really, really wide feet, double check these. But for the most part, we don't really need all of these measurements, just the main ones that I've mentioned, or should be suitable for most people. So the thing is with measuring your feet, after you've measured your feet and you've written those measurements down, what you're going to need to do is knit a gauge swatch. Now, I recommended in the directions that you cast on about 40 stitches and knit about 5 inches. And that's really a lot. You don't need to quite do that many, but I will caution you, it is nice to have a nice big area to measure so that you get an accurate measurement. If you just cast on just enough to barely measure it, sometimes the measurements aren't always as accurate. So you might not need to make your swatch this big, but you do want to make a nice big swatch so that you can measure it in more than one place, is what we want. So if you are knitting a sock in the round, as we are, you also want to knit your gauge swatch in the round. And you want to use the exact same yarn and the exact same needles that you're going to make with your sock. Ideally, you would also want to knit it in the same method that you're going to knit your sock. So if you're going to use double pointed needles or magic loop, you should knit your gauge swatch in the exact same method as you plan to make your sock. And that will give you the most accurate gauge swatch. Again, with the sock, with this, it's not as crucial if it is 100% accurate. It's not like a fitted sweater or something. So don't let this stress you out or cause too much anxiety. But it's actually quite easy once we get into it. So once we have knitted our gauge swatch, what we're going to do is we're going to make our gauge swatch suitable for our measurements. So it's not like we're trying to match somebody else's gauge. We're going to build our sock around this gauge. And so I'm going to measure my gauge swatch. And to measure your gauge swatch, you want to make sure you're isolating your knit stitches. You want to make sure you're looking at your knit stitches. So this is what our knit stitch looks like, this V shape right here. You want to make sure you're not looking at that shape, which is half of one stitch and half of another stitch. Let me see. Is that lighting better or worse? It might be actually. So that's what we're looking for. That is the stitch. I think that might be worse. Hard to get good lighting here it's getting dark very early in Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's better, Darren, right there.
Better?
Mm-hmm.
So we are going to count our gauge. So you just want to make sure you're lining the number 1, the beginning edge of your inch, right along that edge. You don't want to have it scooched one way or the other. And then we're just going to count them straight across. Get this lined up nicely. Okay. And so I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 and maybe a fourth. It's almost 10. I think I'm going to call it 10 probably. But when you have a nice big gauge swatch, now I can get down here and count it again in a different spot to see if it's accurate. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, that's almost 11. So did I count that? Sometimes I get off track. Sometimes I count every, let me double check it again over here. Maybe it's easier to see. So right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm going to say that's almost 10 and a half. So that's what your stitch count would be. 10 and a half stitches equal 4 inches. You want to write that down and keep track of that number. Now, I will recommend also when you're counting your gauge, it's better to use a hard ruler like this and not a tape measure, because a tape measure, sometimes it doesn't lay flat and you'll be tempted to push it down, and that might make your knitting kind of flare out and make the measurement inaccurate. So it is nice to have a hard ruler when you're measuring gauge and not use the tape measure. Okay. All right. So earlier when I measured the gauge, I went with it being 10 stitches equal 4 inches. So I am not good at math. So I'm not a mathematician. Math and logic are not my strong suits. So I wrote all of this out in advance. So what we want to do is we want to determine how many stitches are in 4 inches. Okay, before I go any further though, I do want to stop here for a second and just ask, are there any questions about anything I've talked about so far? Is any of this making any sense to anyone? How are we doing?
All good so far. I don't see any questions coming up.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so 10 stitches equal 4 inches. And that is just, you physically, you measure the gauge and you write it down. But what we really need to know is how many stitches are in 1 inch. So you just divide 10 by 4, and you get 2.5 stitches equal 1 inch. And that's the number that we want to work with. And then you're going to measure your foot. So around the ball of your foot, my measurement was 9.5 inches. So I'm going to multiply 2.5 stitches, which equals 1 inch, by 9.5 inches, which is my foot. And so it's 23.75 stitches. That's what it will take to go around my foot. Okay. Does that make sense? Do we have any questions about how I arrived at this number? Doing good?
No, that makes sense. Yeah, all good.
Okay, all right. It sounds like a bunch of craziness when I'm talking about it, but it does make sense. So this is the actual stitch count that I would use to make something that fit my exact foot. But when we're knitting and we're making items, there's a term it's called ease. And the word ease, when we're referring to clothing, talks about how tight or how loose something is on your body. So with a sock, we want it to be very tight and very snug. Like with a glove, you would want it to be tight. And so the item that you're making will actually have negative ease. So the item will be smaller than your body and be very, very tight. Now a sweater, like if you want a big baggy sweater, then that has positive ease. You could put 5 or 10 or 12 inches of positive ease in something to make it very baggy. But for a sock, you want it to be tight so it doesn't keep slipping down. So that's called negative ease. So we need to calculate what we need to do for negative ease. And a rough estimate is 10% smaller than the body part you're knitting for. So you want it to be 10% smaller than your foot. And that's a good kind of rule of thumb. You can play with that number, adjust it as needed. So I'm going to take my stitch count, my 23.75, multiply that by 0.10, and I get 2.35. And that is, I need to subtract that number from my stitch count, and I end up with 21.4 stitches. And that is, I'm getting very close to my cast on number. All right, so this amount of stitches is 10% smaller than my actual foot. So that's how we got here. Any questions about anything so far?
Well, Allie was asking about rounding it up to 24 earlier when you were talking about 23.75, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think the lesson might be just to take it one step at a time as we're doing this.
So again, I'm not great at math, but I feel like we should continue to use the fractions until we get to the very end, because I feel like that's going to give us, if we start rounding up and down like mid-process, I feel like that might throw us off. So I feel like keeping the fractions until we get to the very end is probably more accurate. And if anyone wants to comment on that, I will be glad to hear any advice. But so 21.4 stitches that's 10% smaller than my foot, okay? And so here at this point is where I would either round up or round down to the next largest or to the next whole number. So whichever way you want to go. Typically, I might round up. I might go to 22 stitches because you don't want your sock to be too tight. But I think I'm going to go with 21 stitches and round down. And that number will become more important later, and I'll tell you why. But we're going to be working with 3 knitting needles later on 3 double-pointed needles. And 21 is divisible by 3, so I can put 7 stitches on each one of my knitting needles. So that kind of makes that a little bit of an easier number to work with. But you can do either number, whichever one is best for you. And so now all of these numbers are based off of my measurement and my knitting gauge. So you are going to do your measurements and your knitting gauge, and your numbers are all going to be different because you're not matching mine, you're matching your own. But the formula and the logic of how you get to these numbers will be the same. So any questions about that? I don't want you to think you have to sort it out so that you're at 21, because if you're using different yarn, if you have bigger or smaller feet, it's going to change. So any questions?
No questions. This is making a lot of sense, Darren.
Okay, good, because I'm always afraid it's going to make 0 sense. Perfect. Okay, so now that we know what our cast on is going to be, we can actually start knitting, and we can actually start having some fun, because I don't particularly like math, and I don't necessarily like all that planning. So
Oh,
now
Darren,
the fun part will start.
before we jump in, there was a question that just came in from Cindy, who was asking about the measurement that we just got. Is that the foot measurement around the ball of the foot? How is?
Yes, that is the measurement for the around the ball of the foot. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out, we're going to cast on for the toe. We're going to increase until we get to the size of the ball of our foot, subtract 10%, and then we're going to knit for a while just to make the foot. So that's what that measurement is for here. Okay, and we're going to cast on a few stitches, and then we're going to increase until we get to here. And the shape of the toe is basically like this. So now we're going to cast on a few stitches here. We're going to knit and increase so that we can make the size of our foot, and then we'll knit straight on until we get to the point where it's going to reach where the foot and the leg join. Does that make sense? That clears it out?
Yes, that clears it up.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes because I've done this so many times, sometimes I skip over little things that might make it more easier to understand. So yes, any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So this next thing I'm going to show you is a cast on. And this is Judy's Magic Cast On. And I think the woman's name's Judy I think it's Judy Bennett that invented this. No, Becker. It's Judy Becker is the one that invented this. So if you want to look her up and see any information about her. I'm going to demonstrate it first with 2 different needles and with 2 different colors of yarn so you can see what I'm doing. When you're doing this in real life, you wouldn't do it this way. But for demonstration purposes, I'm going to demonstrate it this way so you can see what I'm doing. And I like to start off with a slip knot, and other people, when they do this, they don't always start with a slip knot. So you can try it both ways and see what you think. And so I'm putting a slip knot on my needle. And you want to kind of open this up so that it looks similar to how you would be doing the long tail cast on, okay? But what you're going to do that's different is we're going to have 2 needles in our hand at the same time. And you can either think of this as the back needle or the needle that's on top, and this could be the front needle or the needle that's on the bottom. So, but you want to maintain these positions. You don't want to switch them around or anything. So this one is, I always think of this one as the back and this one as the front. And then you're going to open up your yarn. And like I said, typically you would not have 2 different colors of yarn. And what's going to happen is the front needle is always going to pick up yarn from the back. So my thumb is closer to me, so I'm going to call that the front. And my pointer finger is pointing away, and that yarn is farther away, so I'm going to call that the back. Okay. So the front needle is going to pick up yarn from the back, and the back needle is going to pick up yarn from the front. The front needle, and you can bring the yarn to the needle or you can bring the needle to the yarn, however you want. So the front needle will pick up yarn from the back, and then the back needle pick up yarn from the front. Front needle, pick up yarn from the back, and the back needle will pick up yarn from the front. Okay, so start that again to show you. Does that any questions about that? I'm going to show you again, but any specific point that looks more confusing?
I think we want to see it again. Do you have any tips for knowing how much yarn you'll need for a sock based off of this formula, or?
It depends on how big the foot is, and it depends on how long of a leg that you want. But today I'm using this Hometown Bonus Bundle by Lion Brand Yarn, and it's available on lionbrand.com or michaels.com. And I think one of these bonus bundles would make 2 pair of socks fairly easily. And then if you want to use a different color for the heel and the toe, then that makes it nice as well. And you can use that alternate color up the leg to make stripes if you want to make it longer. So I think 2 balls of this would definitely make a nice big pair of socks. Okay. So I've got my yarn and my needle set up for my cast on. This is Judy's Magic Cast On. So the front needle is going to pick up yarn from the back, and then the back needle is going to pick up yarn from the front. Front needle, pick up yarn from the back, and then the back needle, pick up yarn from the front. And then this is kind of what it looks like when you're doing it. We're not going to cast on a lot. I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes. Okay. Has anyone used this cast on before? So this is what it would look more like as you're really knitting. So I'm going to start. And depending on how big of yarn you're using and what size yarn you're using, or what size needles you end up using, depending on your gauge, you're going to cast on a different number of stitches for the toe. So for this great big yarn, I only cast on 3 stitches for the toe. If you're using sock yarn, you might end up casting on 9 or even 12 stitches for the very edge of the toe. It just depends on how your gauge is working out. And the nice thing about working toe up is you can cast on stitches for the toe, start working the toe. Once you get to here, you can decide if it's shaped right. Sometimes, if depending on your gauge, it might be really pointy, and sometimes it might be super flat. So that way you can decide, and then you can rip it out and give it another go if you don't like how it looks. Okay. So I'm going to start 2 different size needles. So my front needle is going to pick up from the back, and the back needle will pick up from the front. Front needle pick up from the back, and the back needle pick it up from the front. Okay. And that's all I'm going to cast on for right now. And another thing I like to do is I like to end with the stitch on my back needle. And the reason that is if you end with a stitch on your front needle, when I go to knit into that stitch, it's just hanging over my needle and it's not really attached to anything. So by adding 1 more stitch on the back, it kind of locks that stitch into place. Okay. Now for creating the sock, for the one that I was the pretend sock I'm making for my gauge, it was 21 stitches is what I decided my number was going to be. So I need to keep increasing until I get to 21 stitches. So I'm going to do a knit front and back on the very first stitch. And sometimes it's really hard to do it on the first stitch. So if you want to knit around straight on without increasing, that might make it a little easier. So you can totally do that. So increase on the very first stitch on the very first needle, and then do an increase on the very last stitch. I was knitting with my tail. So do an increase with your very last stitch on your first needle. So I'm not going to go back. I'm just going to go with what I did. So we don't want to start over. Waste your time, okay? So that was my first needle. And now I'm going to go to my second needle. And I'm going to increase again. I'm going to knit on the do an increase on the very first stitch. On the first stitch of that needle. So knit front and back. And frequently on the back needle, the stitches get twisted. So if you're very, very careful when you're making your cast on, you can make them not twisted, but I usually end up with mine twisted. So you just want to double check each one and make sure it's not twisted as you're going. And on that last stitch, you want to do another increase. So I'm going to knit front and back. Oops, don't split your yarn. Okay. So now I've increased 2 stitches on each needle, so a total of 4. And then for the next, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I need to continue in this way until I end up with 21 total stitches. Any questions?
Yes, we're all very excited about this because this is the first time for a lot of people in the chat. But there was a question, does it matter the direction in which you're casting on? So the direction which you're putting the yarn onto the needles?
You mean the way you're wrapping them?
Yes.
Yes, and that's where you can end up with your twisted stitches. So when you're wrapping your yarn, it should always be wrapped counterclockwise. So if you try to remember that while you're casting on, then you'll be fine. But half the time I end up forgetting and just get excited about casting on. So when I knit my first round, then I double check my stitch mount. And if they're not correct, I can correct them at that point. So. So I increase a total of 4 more stitches. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So I'm going to keep going. Any other questions?
No other questions. Just a reminder, we are at the halfway point already, believe it or not.
And just like magic, I have finished knitting my toe. Isn't that magical? Isn't that wonderful? Okay. So after you have increased all of your stitches, I finished my toe and I'm ready to knit the foot of my sock. So what you want to do is we want to decide how many, we want to decide what's going to be the top and what's going to be the bottom. So we're going to have a top of a sock and the bottom of a sock where the foot is going to be. So it doesn't matter. Maybe one side has a twisted stitch, or maybe one side looks better than the other, and you might want the better looking side on the top. So we're going to have this be the top. And so for this sock, which I made this swatch at a different time, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So for this sock, I needed 13, 14, 15, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So for this sock, I needed 25 stitches. And so what I'm going to do is I have 24 on the top. I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 on the top. So I'm going to divide that in half. I'm going to put 6 on one needle. 6 on one needle and 6 on the other needle. And then I have 25 on the bottom. So I have 24 across the top for this sock. And then I have 25 on the bottom. And I like to demonstrate how that works because sometimes you do have an odd number. And if you have an odd number, what you want to do is try to maintain that odd number across the bottom of your foot. So that way the top of the foot, you end up with an even number on the top. So I have 6, 6, and 25. And you want to set it up this way, and this is going to start creating the shape of your foot. And at this point, and you can use Magic Loop if you want. If you're using Magic Loop, you might just want to use stitch markers to break up the shape of the foot. And then you just start knitting in the round, just like normal. And you're going to knit until you reach the measurement of from your toe to where your leg and foot connect, so the top of your foot. Let me go back to my pen. So you're going to continue knitting from the toe and across to where your foot and your leg meet. But you also want to remember, you do want it a little tighter, and so you might want to take off that 10% ease. So, you know, just whatever that measurement is, take off the 10% for ease, so that way it's not, sometimes I forget to do that, and then the sock is a little big. So don't make that mistake, take off your 10% ease. Any questions about that?
There was a question that came in a little bit late, but you said that you started casting on with 3 stitches. So if you were using a smaller weight yarn, would you still cast on with 3 stitches to begin with, or would you increase that number?
No, you would want to double check all of those numbers, and depending on the size of yarn you're using. So if you're using a sock weight yarn, so you're going to want to make some adjustments. If I were using a sock weight yarn, you would maybe cast on, instead of 3, you might cast on 6 or 9 or even 12, depending on how you want your toe to be shaped. If you only cast on 3, then you might end up with a really kind of pointy toe. And if, again, with this very large yarn, I did my increase every round. I increase by 4 every round. But if you're using sock weight yarn, you'll be making less progress with each round. So you might want to increase every other round or every 3rd round, or you might start out increasing every round and then gradually transition to every other round or something like that. So that is one of the nice parts about knitting toe up, because if you're making these decisions on your own, it doesn't take long to knit the toe, even with sock yarn. And then once you reach the number of stitches you're going to be working with, you stop everything, and then you look at it and evaluate the shape. And if it's shaped really weird, if it looks goofy, or try it on your foot, and if it's like something's really wrong, then you can rip it out and kind of start again, making notes as you go. And so depending on your gauge and the size of yarn you're working with, you want to make adjustments as you go. And that's my favorite part. I really like figuring those things out. I don't like to be told what to do. So, so that's that. Any other questions? How did that answer the question?
That answered the question. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so you're going to continue knitting until you've made the top of the foot. And then once you've made the top of the foot, you're ready to start your gusset, okay? And so the gusset, again, is this little triangular space. And what that does is that opens up your fabric and it creates a lot of extra room. And that's what a gusset does. You might, if you sew or knit other items, you'll find that gussets are used to add shape and to create space in a garment. And so instead of it being this wide, now with the gusset, it's opened up to make it that wide. So you can see it can really change, even though it's a very small gusset, it can really change the shape of your item. So we're going to create that triangular gusset. And that's where that's why it's so very important that we have our sock set up a certain way. And so this is a very small sock, this sample here. And so we're going to knit. I've changed it to a different yarn so you can kind of see what I'm doing. So we're going to knit across. And if you would use the same size needle, I just picked up a small needle by mistake. We're going to knit across, just like normal, the bottom of our foot. So this is the bottom of our foot. Oops. And then now that I'm moving to the top of my foot, so to create my gusset, you want to do an increase on the very first stitch. So I'm going to do knit front and back on the very first stitch. And I put that stitch marker there to help me remember. Slip the marker, knit all the way across. So I'm knitting across my first needle. And I'm knitting across my next needle. And when I get to the very last stitch, I'm going to do another increase. So I'm going to slip my marker, very last stitch, another increase. Now, what you want to do is you're going to then knit the bottom. The stitches on the bottom of the foot are never going to change. So you're going to maintain the same stitch count on the bottom. You're not going to change that. So you're just going to knit straight across, not changing the stitch count. And you do want to, you're only going to do increases for the gusset every other round. So for the most part, that is kind of a rule of thumb. And again, if you're using sock yarn or a very small yarn, you might want to do it like every third round. So you can kind of play with that and see how that works out. But for this large yarn, I only do the increase every other round. So you would then just knit straight on, not do any increase. Any questions about anything we've covered so far?
No.
Any questions about the gusset? It makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, wow. Well, usually I'm not always sure I'm making sense. So new experience for me. All right. So now we've got the gusset. Oh, let me hold on one second. I didn't explain something. So how do you know when you finished your gusset? So all of this information is in your handout. So you can go back and review it to make sure you understand all of the information. If I skip something by mistake. So I drew this little drawing to just kind of represent your knitting. So the top of your foot would be, of your sock would be here. And in this situation, there are 7 stitches on each one. And then the bottom, there are 15 stitches on the bottom. This number will never change. You will always keep 15 stitches on the bottom. As you're knitting around, you're going to increase here, and then knit across the bottom, do 1 round straight on, and then increase here and increase here. You're going to continue working in this way until you've doubled the stitches on top. So instead of 7 stitches, there will be 14 stitches. Instead of 7 stitches here, there will be 14 stitches. So you're going to continue knitting in this way until you've doubled the stitches that are on the top of your foot. And that's creating extra space for, as your foot gets larger in that part of the shape of your foot and leg, you want to create extra room for your foot because it's expanding there. Any questions about that? And then once you've doubled that top number, you're ready to start the next step. Questions?
No questions yet. This is making a lot of sense, Darren.
Okay, this is amazing.
I know.
Okay, so now the heel turn. Okay, so what we've done, we've explained up to this part. We've got our toe, we've got our foot, we've got our gusset. And so now we need to learn how to make this. So you can see this little piece right here, it kind of curves up, and that's called turning the heel, because it's changing the stitches from going straight this direction to turning up. And that makes perfect sense. It's called the heel turn because it turns. And let me show you how we're going to do that. So for just a little bit, we're going to be knitting flat. We're not going to be knitting in the round anymore. For just the next 2 steps. So it's very important that you don't knit in the round. We're going to be knitting flat back and forth. And I want to show you how to do short rows. So we're going to knit across. And I will demonstrate this again after I show you, because it's not complicated, but if you've never done it before, it might look a little trickier than it is. Okay, so knit across. And then this last stitch, I'm not going to knit, I'm just going to slip it. And then I'm going to bring my yarn to the front. I'm wrapping it. This is called wrap and turn. This is a short row, because it's a short row because I'm not continuing on around. I'm turning and going back. Okay, so that stitch was not knitted. Now I'm going to purl, and I have to reposition my yarn to purl. And when I do that, that causes the yarn now to wrap all the way around that stitch. So now I'm going to purl. Purl. The last stitch, again, I'm going to slip it. When you slip a stitch, you always slip it as if to purl. So you, whether you're knitting or purling, you enter the stitch this direction as if to purl, slip it over because you're not twisting the stitch in that way. You're going to wrap your yarn, you're going to slip it back, not twisting it, turn your work because we're working flat. I have to reposition my yarn to knit, so put my yarn in the back, and I'm going to knit. Now I'm only going to knit across. I'm not going to knit the stitch that I slipped. So this was my wrap and turn from before. I'm not going to knit that. I'm going to slip the one right in front of it, wrap, slip it back, turn. So again, I just want to double check and make sure I explain this very clearly. You slip that over as if to purl. So let me just start that wrap and turn over so I can make sure you get that. So knit to the one stitch before the last one, enter that stitch as if to purl, slip it over, bring the yarn to the front, slip it back, being careful not to twist it, turn your work, position your yarn to purl, and go across. Any questions?
There was a question, actually. Someone's asking, they wrap their yarn around the needle in the opposite direction that you do. Is that going to make a difference in the overall look of the sock if they do it the way they do it?
What I just did? Oh, one second. Oh, what did I do? Okay. So if I understand the question, are they not entering the stitch? They're not wrapping the yarn this direction? Are they wrapping it this direction? They're wrapping it this direction.
I believe so, yes.
Well, you want to make sure you're not ending up with twisted stitches. So if you wrap your yarn in this direction, you're going to quite possibly have twisted stitches, unless if you're doing other, I mean, sometimes there's ways around that where you can untwist it. You want to make sure that when you're looking at your knit stitches, that they're shaped like a V like this, but that the legs are not crossed. You want to make sure that they are not crossed. A twisted stitch, I don't have a twisted stitch here, so I can't really demonstrate it, but a twisted stitch, it would look more like this leg is over top of that leg, and you wouldn't see that opening. Does that make sense? So if your stitches are twisted and you're ending up with them looking kind of like that, when they're just resting normal, your knitting will be very tight and it will be more textural, and it's not necessarily going to work with like a slip knit. You might run into trouble. Or what do you think, Sam? How do you explain that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I'd be worried about twisted stitches. They're saying that their stitches come out looking correct, but I would do it the way Darren's doing it, just to be on the safe side.
And there is a method of knitting, which I'm not familiar with, called combination knitting, where people twist their stitches when they make them and then they untwist them when they do the purl. So, I mean, there are many different ways of doing it right, but I would be cautious of that. So, okay, so I finished my last wrap. So here's a wrap. So when I knit across these, I have to pick up my wraps now. And so you're going to find these. Oh, wait, no, that wasn't my last one. Sorry. So one more wrap. Okay, so now I'm back on the knit side. So when I come across these wraps, I can't knit them just straight on. I have to pick them up. So, and it's kind of easy to see that something weird has happened here, right? Something's kind of going on there that looks different. So a couple of ways you can do this. One way is I slip my stitch, I pick up the wrap, I put my stitch back over, and then you knit them together. Okay. Another way, which I've seen people do it, is you take this wrap, you pick it up and put it on your needle, and then you knit them together. But I have always done it this way, where you pick up the stitch, you transfer it over, pick up the wrap, and then knit them together. And I've done it both ways, and I don't think it actually looks any different when it's done. How do you do it, Sam? How do you like it?
I do mine the second way.
Second way. Do you think the first way is okay, or although you do it the second way?
I think it's fine. I'm just a creature of habit.
That's how I am. So, but sometimes I see other people doing things different ways, and I like to pass that. There's so many ways of doing things, and they can all be correct. Have I gone too far? Okay, so to pick these up on the purl side, one stitch too far. Nope, that was all right. So to pick them up on the purl side, you want to, same thing, I slip it over, pick up the wrap, and then purl them together. So it's pretty much the same. Slip over the stitch, pick up the wrap, and then purl them together. Slip over the stitch, pick up the wrap, and then purl them together. So a general rule of thumb, and because this little sock here is so tiny, I made it small so that I could work through it easily for demonstrating. It wouldn't take too long. But because this is so tiny, I did the wrap and turn on every stitch. But if you are making a sock with sock yarn and stuff, you might not do it on every stitch. You want to leave some in the middle because your heel is not like perfectly pointy shaped. So a general rule of thumb is continue your wrap and turn until you have 25% of your stitches left in the middle between your last two wrap and turns. So let's say you had 24 stitches total on the bottom. Half of 24 is 12. So you would continue working until you had 6 stitches in the middle. And that's going to give you a fairly nicely shaped heel, depending on what your gauge is and your needle size and your yarn size. So that's another one of those things you might want to play with that a little bit, depending on how your stitches are working up for your personal sock. But you don't want to do it for everyone. I just did it for everyone on this one because it's such a tiny, tiny little heel. Any questions about that? And I have that in the handout to demonstrate for you. Any questions at all?
No questions so far.
Okay. All right, so now that we've finished our heel turn, so people talk about turning a heel like it's going to be this really complicated thing, and that wasn't so hard, was it? Did that seem hard? All right, so this sock here is knitted up to where I turned the heel. Now I'm going to start working on my heel flap. And the heel flap is what creates the space for the back of your foot. So you want to close off that space for the back. So now we're right here. We have to go up here. And we're still knitting flat. At this point, we're still going to be knitting flat. So I'm going to purl across. And you might end up on a knit side or a purl side when you finish your heel flap. I'm sorry, when you finish your heel turn. So just work whichever row is next, maintaining your stockinette stitch, working flat. We're not working the top of our stitches at all. And at this point, when you get to the last stitch, you want to transfer that to this needle. And we are going to purl those two together. And this is going to bring us up the back side of our sock and create that flap. Okay? And then, so again, the bottom stitches are not going to change the number. But now what's going to happen is the top stitches, one on each side, we're going to subtract 1 stitch off each time. And that is going to, so don't knit the last stitch, transfer the last stitch to your needle that's from the top, and then knit those two together. So you'll either be knitting them together or purling them together, depending on which row you're on. Turn your work across, you're going to purl across because we're working stockinette stitch flat. It's very important that you don't forget and knit in the round. I guess you could do garter stitch on this if you wanted a different texture of a heel. There are many, many different types of heel textures you can use. So, but for keeping things simple, at this point, stockinette is very nice. So transfer that stitch from your bottom needle to the one from the top, and then we're going to knit those two together. And then bringing that to the bottom. So now we have one less stitch on the top. The bottom number remains the same. Any questions about what I'm doing?
So there is a question. How do you make sure that the heel is going to last for a long time and not wear out?
Well, for a sock like this, which is, made out of this great big bulky yarn, you wouldn't have to worry about it so much because it's, basically a house slipper. When you're working on a proper sock that you're going to be wearing in shoes and kind of jamming it in and out of boots and shoes, that's where the real wear and tear is going to take place. Most sock yarn contains at least like 10% to 25% nylon, which is very, very strong. And that's what will help keep your socks from getting holes in them as quickly. Another thing you could do is get a piece of strong nylon thread and hold that with your yarn as you're knitting with it, and that will help to give it a little bit of strength as well. But if you're making socks that you're going to wear a lot, you do want to make sure that you're using sock yarn with nylon in them. I've made several socks out of just regular wool that are made out of a worsted weight, and I've worn holes in them, but then you get to darn them, and like repairing socks and darning socks is a whole other thing that's a lot of fun. So just because you've worn a hole in them doesn't mean that the fun is over. The fun is just beginning at that point. Does that answer any other questions?
No other questions, but we are a few minutes out from the end of this class. It's been great.
Well, we are almost done. So you continue knitting in this way, knitting these two stitches together on each side until you get back to your original stitch count. So what we did was we continued knitting the top until we doubled our stitches. So like this example went from 7 to 14 on each side. And so you're going to continue knitting back and forth, flat, joining, picking up those stitches and knitting them or purling them together as required. You're going to continue knitting in that way until you're back to your original stitch count. So in this example, it would be 7, 7, and 15. That's how you know when you've finished your heel flap. And so then we have reached this part of our sock. So really all of the sock magic is now done, and we're just going to be knitting straight on, and you can make the leg as big as you want, or you could stop right here basically and do like a little footy sock, like a little slipper. You can pretty much do anything you want at that point. I like to, you'd want to finish your sock with some type of a ribbing, like a knit 2, purl 2 rib, a knit 1, purl 1 rib, something like that. It makes it a little bit elastic, so it's going to stay up. If you think about your socks, they always have ribbing around the top. You can go down a needle size if you want the ribbing to be really tight, but I will caution you, you don't want the ribbing to be so tight that it won't stretch over your foot. That can be a big problem. And then for casting off, for the bind off, I'm going to show you a stretchy bind off. It's called Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off. And it is surprisingly stretchy. And it was created by Jenny, and her last name is Staiman, S-T-A-I-M-A-N. So if you want to look up Jenny and thank her for her magical stretchy bind off. So you start off binding off as normal. I'm just going to do it on my swatch here. So you knit a stitch and you do a backwards yarn over. So if I were going to do a yarn over, I would do it this way. You do a backwards yarn over, and then you knit another stitch the proper way. And now I have 3 stitches on my needle. You bring them over, you bind each one of those stitches off, and I always do it one at a time. Now I'm down to 1 stitch. Backwards yarn over, oops, sorry, backwards yarn over. You don't get to wrap your yarn in the wrong direction very often, so this is one time I approve. But for the person that's wrapping their yarn backwards already, you might want to wrap it the other way. I'm not sure how that would work. So backwards yarn over, and then knit, and then bind both of those off. Any questions about this bind off? And I will promise you, it is surprisingly stretchy. Any questions?
No questions about the bind off, but do you have any tips for blocking the socks once you've finished them?
That's the easiest part because of the negative ease, they are going to block right around your feet. If you're making them for somebody else and you don't want to put them on your feet, there are sock blockers you can buy that are metal. They basically kind of look like a wire clothes hanger, and you can block them on those. Also, if you want to take pictures of your socks when they're finished, they look very nice on those sock blockers. I think sometimes they're wooden or metal, but that's a good way to block socks. But if they're just for you, once you put them on your feet, they kind of block around your feet. And if you don't want to do this surprisingly stretchy bind off, sometimes it does tend to, instead of sit really nice, sometimes it tends to kind of splay out at the top just a little bit. One thing you can also do is you can bind off in pattern. So you could like bind off with your knits and your purls going the way that you knitted them. You can go down a needle size and then bind off in pattern, but or go up a needle size would probably be better depending on your knitting. The last thing you want is your bind off to be so tight that you can't stretch it around your foot or it won't pull up your ankle. So I would recommend going up a needle size and then binding off in pattern to kind of make it stretchy. But I really just love the surprisingly stretchy one. How do you feel about the surprisingly stretchy one, Sam?
You know, I actually just did this one on my last whip and I'm kind of in love with it. I typically go up a needle size and then bind off in pattern, but I've never actually tried this bind off on a pair of socks before. So
yeah,
I'm gonna try it.
I recommend it. Jenny is a genius. So between Jenny and Judy, we're covered on toe and cuff. And you can see it's actually very stretchy. It really is. It's surprisingly stretchy. I was very surprised the first time I did it. So, all right, so we're pretty much done. We covered a lot in class today. If you have any questions as you're knitting and you have your handout, you can feel free to contact me on social media. So if you want to find me on Instagram, maybe Sam will put my Instagram name in the chat. It's Mr. Woolly Bear, M-I-S-T-E-R spelled out. So M-I-S-T-E-R Woolly Bear. And if you want to find me on Facebook, it's just my name, Darren Morris, just spelled out the way it is. Feel free to send me a direct message. If you have any questions, if you get hung up on any of these areas, I know we plowed through this really fast. I'll be glad to help you going forward. If you make a sock, then I would love it if you want to post a picture on social media, if you tag me in it, would love that. I would love to see what you're up to. Any other questions, Sam? Anything
No
else?
other questions. We all have a lot of homework to do. A lot of practicing. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to add the handout to the chat one more time before we leave. And what we hope that you'll join us again next Monday for how to knit hole repair, which I think is going to answer some of the questions people had about darning. So thank you.
All right. Have a great night. Thanks for, don't forget to practice. Thanks for coming to class.